An infamous murder by the M25 motorway.
Danielle shouts to Stephen, "Steve, he's got a knife."
A road rage incident that turned deadly.
Nobody saw the car after he left the scene. He simply disappeared.
And an international manhunt to bring a notorious killer to justice.
He had the resources and the connection. Easier to get away with things, it's much easier to hide if you've got money.
This murder town is Swanley.
We're all keeping some secrets.
Killers are unpredictable. They can attack anyone at any time. Their motives are often varied. And chillingly, in a number of cases, their reason to kill is completely unknown. Some can be organised and planned with meticulous efficiency, whilst others are more opportunistic. They live amongst us in our towns and cities, and one thing sets them apart from the rest of society: their terrifying capacity to kill. Welcome to Murdertown.
Do you feel it in the air? Everything is changing, a world wasted by fear. Something wicked this way comes. Something wicked this way comes. It's been around since time began. A million times around our sun. Something wicked this way comes. Something wicked this way comes.
This is Swanley in Kent. A relatively small town, it's home to around 16,000 people. 16 miles southeast from central London, it sits just inside the M25 motorway, making it a popular location for commuters to the capital.
Swanley was a nice town come village, had a good community feel. Swanley is very much a commuter town now for London. It's half an hour on the train from Swanley railway station, and not somewhere that you'd think would be an epicentre for crime.
Swanley is in a funny position because it's on the edge of beautiful countryside, and yet it is part of the London sprawl. It is an area where a lot of people migrated to from the more dense conurbations of southeast London, so it has a large working class element, and with that large working class element you have the community spirit. If they didn't know you, they knew somebody who did know you.
This wasn't a town known to many outside the area. However, in May 1996, that all changed when 21-year-old electrician Stephen Cameron set off from his home to travel into London with his fiancée, Danielle, to buy bagels. It was a journey that would take a dramatic turn when they left the M25 here, just outside Swanley.
Stephen Cameron and Danielle were staying at Stephen's house in Swanley. Danielle, she was 17 at the time, had only just passed her driving test in her own car. They decided they would go out and go get some bagels. Stephen had a rascal van that he was setting up with his electrical business. And Stephen convinced Danielle, now that you've passed your driving test, I want you to drive, because there may be occasions where you will need to drive the van. She was very nervous, understandably. She gets onto this slip road and took the road of this unknown driver in a Land Rover Discovery. And the driver then cut across the front of the rascal van, being driven by Danielle with Stephen in the front passenger seat. I believe there was some gesticulation by Stephen towards the driver, who then saw, I'm not putting up with this, saw red, got out of the vehicle, as did Stephen. Danielle stayed in the driving seat, having been told by Stephen, stay there. And she's now got a front row seat, so to speak, of what's happening, and the two of them in front of her, and they're exchanging blows. Stephen Cameron was a very fit 21-year-old, was getting the better of the older man. The man turned round. Stephen thought he was getting back in his vehicle. End of the confrontation. He turns round to get back into the van. Incident over. And Danielle shouts to Stephen, "Steve, he's got a knife." Stephen then turns round and he is stabbed twice. And at that stage, the man gets back into this Land Rover Discovery and disappears.
Stephen Cameron fell back into the arms of Danielle, and as a result of that, she was covered in blood. She was hysterical. She managed to make a phone call to Ken Cameron, Stephen's dad, who was at home watching the Monaco Grand Prix. She could only just about state that Stephen had been stabbed and where they were, and as a result of that, Ken got in his car and drove to the scene.
The knife had penetrated Stephen's heart and liver. His fiancée, Danielle, had witnessed the incident, along with a number of other motorists, who were able to give the police a detailed description of the man responsible.
On that Sunday, there were lots of people out and about in their vehicles, and they saw an incident. Some saw what they thought was someone plunging something towards a young man. But they didn't see it all. They just see parts of it. So it's like a jigsaw. But the main component of that jigsaw was what Danielle saw. The irony was, of course, Stephen, when he'd been stabbed, Danielle took him in her arms, and all he said to her was, "Danielle, get the number, get the registration number." And nobody got the full registration number of the vehicle. The best we could ever do was get it as an L-registered Land Rover Discovery. And out of the 30 people that saw these bits of what went on, we had 5 different colours for this Land Rover Discovery, which ranged from black to dark grey, silver to maroon to green.
Although police had a make and model of a car and a letter of the registration, there were 18,000 L-registered Land Rover Discoveries on their database at that time.
You do the forensics, you do all the witness statements, knocking on doors, but what you haven't got is any named suspect. All you've got is a description of a middle-aged man driving a Land Rover Discovery, and he's disappeared.
The police were able to use witness descriptions of the attacker to build up an e-fit image of the suspect, which was then released to the public.
So we were getting phone calls from all over the UK, really, about the potential for somebody who they knew was driving or owned an L-registered Land Rover Discovery who might vaguely fit the e-fit. I mean, e-fits are okay, but they're only as good as the witness can produce. And therefore, of course, it's never an exact science. More bad luck, the CCTV cameras weren't working that day. We were struggling to identify in terms of a known suspect or any reasonable suspect in the early stages of the inquiry.
While police gathered as much information as they could about the incident, medical staff were trying to resuscitate Stephen Cameron. But they were too late. Stephen had lost too much blood, and he died at the scene.
Stephen was extremely popular. He had hundreds of friends, literally. There was nobody who had a bad word to say about him. He rarely lost his temper, and then it would just be over very quickly. That doesn't mean to say he was a pushover. Stephen and Danielle were very, very close. They'd met a few years previously, and Danielle had moved in with Tony and Ken Cameron, who treated her like a daughter. They absolutely adored her, and she absolutely adored them. She was part of the family, and that gave her a great sense of belonging.
Detective Nick Biddis was relying on an e-fit picture and some contradictory witness statements to narrow down the search. But the team were about to get a breakthrough on the Land Rover used by the attacker, who, they were to learn, was more than just a killer.
The defendants were brought to court under armed police escort from 3 different London prisons.
He had a reputation of being involved in organised crime.
He was the king of his area, the king of his manor.
On the 19th of May 1996, 21-year-old Stephen Cameron was stabbed during a road rage incident just off the M25 near Swanley. Tragically, the wounds he suffered proved fatal, and he died the same day. Stephen's fiance, Danielle, witnessed the incident, along with fellow motorists. And despite receiving conflicting accounts, the police were able to track down the killer's vehicle.
The police managed to track the Land Rover to Cyprus. They found out that it was registered Anthony Francis, and that Anthony Francis was an alias. And that alias was then named as Kenneth Noy.
But he became a person of significant interest. Within the first week, 10 days of the crime, and was somebody who we needed to trace, interview and eliminate if necessary.
But this was not a random suspect. The name Kenneth Noy was familiar to local police, the media and most of the country. He had an extensive criminal record that stretched all the way back to 1977, when he was first arrested for receiving stolen goods.
I wrote a book about Kenneth Noy called Public Enemy Number 1. Kenneth Noy's career has lasted more than 50 years. In his teens and early 20s, he was handling stolen cars, handling stolen goods from various criminals around the area where he lived. Kenneth Noy comes from southeast London. Southeast London is steeped in criminal history, going back to the Great Train Robbery. Most of those robbers came from that area. They are brought up in, and they go to schools, often with the same policemen who were then chasing them in the 70s and 80s. And so Kenneth Noy had criminality all around him from a young age. It's no surprise that he ended up being a professional criminal. He was the king of his area, the king of his manor. People didn't take him on. He walked into pubs back in the 80s, and if he didn't like what was going on, he'd pull out a sawn-off shotgun and shoot into the ceiling, just to make sure that the people there knew he was in charge.
Kenneth Noy was a man who had a reputation. He had a reputation of being involved in what I would describe as organised crime. He had a history going back to 1977. And most of his crime, most of his criminality appears to be centred in the Metropolitan Police area.
Kenneth Noy had been offending from an early age, but it was his suspected involvement in one of the most notorious robberies in British history that put him firmly on the police's radar.
The Brinks-Mat bullion raid, previously Britain's biggest robbery, £26 million in gold.
The Brinks-Mat robbery occurred in 1983 and saw diamonds, cash and gold bullion stolen from a Heathrow estate warehouse.
Particularly vicious and awful crime. The offenders poured petrol over the guards and threatened to set them on fire and stole what was then £28 million worth of gold bullion. Kenneth Noy's involvement in that crime was to be the handler of the gold bullion. He even bought a smelting machine because they had to change the identity of the gold bars. So his involvement was to handle and be the conduit through which the gold bars could be changed and then recirculated.
Despite believing he played a key part, police weren't able to charge Kenneth Noy for his involvement in the Brinks-Mat robbery. Instead, in 1985, they continued to keep him under surveillance.
There was an operation by the Metropolitan Police that was centred on his house in West Kingsdown. He was subject of a surveillance operation where a police officer, John Fordham, was tragically killed by Kenneth Noy, having been stabbed something like 11 times.
The defendants were brought to court under armed police escort from 3 different London prisons. In court, Kenneth Noy and Brian Reeder were handcuffed to plainclothes policemen. They are charged with murdering Detective Constable Fordham.
Noy was arrested and charged with the murder of surveillance officer John Fordham. But at the trial in December 1985, he pleaded not guilty, claiming self-defense.
Surely the amount of stab wounds just in itself indicates that events didn't happen like Mr. Noy said they happened. Some of the stab wounds were in John's back. Well, I feel absolutely certain that John was trying to get away.
Kenneth Noy was able to convince the jury accordingly, and he was acquitted of the murder of John.
I'm Neil Woods. I'm a former undercover police officer. I spent 14 years infiltrating drug-dealing gangs around the country. For Noy to claim that it's self-defense would suggest that he was attacked. Having worked undercover, I cannot imagine any scenario where a professional undercover operative would suddenly decide to randomly attack somebody. It's part of a feature of working undercover that you are clear-headed. I've never known a fellow undercover operative who had a temper, because a temper is very dangerous in that kind of scenario. And I just can't imagine that that would be the case. But of course, you know, Noy's a gangster, of course he's going to claim that. But I'm sure that was a murder.
Much to the disappointment of the police, following the 1985 court case for the murder of police officer John Fordham, Kenneth Noy became a free man. However, his freedom didn't last for long. His involvement in the Brinks-Mat robbery finally caught up with him.
We have him going to prison, not for that crime, but for avoiding VAT on the gold, because they couldn't get him for the murder because a jury acquitted him.
He was subsequently convicted of the handling of the stolen goods, got 14 years imprisonment.
Kenneth Noy was finally behind bars, and he remained there for the next 8 years. On his release in 1994, however, he returned to the Kent area, and his reputation came with him.
Where's he gone? And it was known that he had actually got access to a Land Rover Discovery. So we needed to find him.
Nobody saw the car after he left the scene. There wasn't anybody who was able to say it had gone into the Kent area or it had gone into central London. He simply disappeared.
In May 1996, Stephen Cameron was brutally stabbed to death just over there at a junction off the M25 in Swanley, Kent. A notorious criminal, Kenneth Noy, who'd already stood trial for the murder of an undercover police officer, was the prime suspect in Stephen's murder. Noy had made this area his home following his release from prison in 1994 for handling stolen goods in the Brinks-Mat robbery a decade earlier.
He was married, a wife, a couple of sons. If you met him and didn't know him, you'd probably think he's just a Mr. Average guy, you know, getting on with his life.
What we have to remember is there's an area of Kent where he spent a lot of his time, which is called in the criminal underworld the Bermuda Triangle. What goes in doesn't come out. You could drive down the street in the village next to where Kenneth Noy lived, and you knew 3 or 4 people would be calling him to say a car that they didn't recognize was driving down that street. These towns were renowned for it. Certain pubs you couldn't go in unless you were a criminal. And it was that atmosphere and that ambience that helped breed even more criminality.
Kenneth Noy had been living in this area and trying to keep a low profile. But the May 1996 road rage incident with Stephen Cameron had seen his violent side emerge once more in a moment of madness, making him the prime suspect in a murder.
The thing with Kenneth Noy is he has criminal contacts, associates. He is well known to have had links with corrupt police officers, and he has money and wealth and power. And the view when his name came out was this is going to be very difficult for Kent Police to find him, to nail him, to bring him back.
With Noy having fled the country, apprehending him suddenly became a lot more difficult, with the police launching an international manhunt.
We were having information coming in about sightings of Kenny Noy all over the world. I'm surprised he wasn't seen on the moon. Almost certainly he was spirited out of the country very shortly after the murder. There were some people that were helpful. Whether you'd call them friends or associates of Kenneth Noy is another matter. There were people that came forward with information, but of course you wouldn't expect me, and neither would I, tell you who they were or where they came from. I don't think any of them were there to put us off the trail, other than people who did ring in occasionally or give us information. Oh, Kenny Noy's been killed, or he's dead, and he's in the bottom of some ocean somewhere, or holding up some flyover. I mean, I always said, unless I see his dead body, I'll never believe he's dead.
The police never gave up hope of tracking down Kenneth Noy and kept up the hunt for several months.
So many phone calls coming in of the sightings of Kenneth Noy throughout the world. You try and evaluate whether or not you would give it some weight, whether or not you might send somebody out to have a look. And we'd sent people out to various countries. I was confident we'd find him. I knew at some stage he'd make a mistake, and we had to be there for when he did make it.
The hunt for Kenneth Noy yielded numerous leads from all around the world that the police chased down, but to no avail. Then in April 1997, nearly a year after Stephen Cameron's murder, a promising breakthrough finally materialised.
Police received a tip-off that Kenneth Noy was holed up in a villa on the Atlantic coast in Spain.
And I decided, well, this one looks quite interesting. And I sent a couple of officers out who knew Kenneth Noy, because what I wanted to do was to establish whether the person that we thought might be living in this area was indeed Kenneth Noy. And then I would set a plan up to see if we could get some evidence to identify him.
If Kenneth Noy, Britain's most wanted man, really was hiding out on the Costa de la Luz, how had he managed to get there and lie low for so long, beyond the reach of the British authorities?
In some respects, it was like a scene from a classic British gangster movie, albeit horrific real life. He was able to make phone calls to associates and to his wife on the day of the murder. He was able to go home, he was able to pack, he was then able to make another phone call to ensure that a helicopter was at his service, get into helicopter, as we know it, with a case full of £10,000 in cash, and then to go to France and subsequently to Spain.
I'm sure Noy would have thought that he could get away with it, that he could live indefinitely without being caught. And there would be a few reasons that would give him that confidence. One of which is the fact that he had the resources and the connections. It's much easier to get away with things, it's much easier to hide if you've got money. And let's not forget that the world he comes from is a world that uses corruption as a commodity. And corruption is the best advantage that you can have in evading capture from the law.
It was clear that the prime suspect in Stephen Cameron's 1996 murder, Kenneth Noy, had significant resources, which had enabled him to remain at large for nearly a year. So it was vital for the UK and Spanish authorities to work closely together to avoid him slipping the net once more.
What he did when he got to Spain was a complete makeover. He reinvented himself with a new name, a new look for his passport picture, everything. And what's so stunning, though, is despite being Britain's most wanted man, he survived for a long time in Spain. He created a new life for himself.
Having spent months trying to track down their prime suspect, the police finally had a promising lead in identifying Kenneth Noy. However, if they were going to interview him about Stephen Cameron's murder, they would have to catch him first.
As a result of the Spanish police picking up a glass that Kenneth Noy had used, they were able to identify him and to confirm that exactly that was him.
The officers went out, and you've got to remember, these officers, very brave, I think, because when John Fordham was killed, he had the backup of a full Metropolitan team with him outside of the area where he was killed. These two went out with no backup at all into an area that they didn't know, looking for a person who had a known history of violence, a known history of actually killing and stabbing a police officer to death. So I am putting two officers out there in Spain. Believe you me, that was a worrying time for me. Rules were to keep safe, to make sure that they did ring me 2 or 3 times a day, and their only job was to identify the person that we had this information on as Kenneth Noy. Nothing else. I didn't want them to confront anybody, certainly not to be seen by him in the sense that he would recognise them as Kent police officers, and so to be as covert and as secretive as they could. But as soon as they'd done that, they then come home straight away. Don't want them to do anything else. I then get the phone call after a couple of days, which it was those magic words, "It's him, Gov."
The police had done an impressive job in tracking Noy down, as it was clear he'd had the resources and the help to cover his tracks well. Finding him was one thing, arresting him would be quite another.
We didn't have any warrant to arrest him, especially in Spain. Come back, we'll work a plan out about getting him identified through Danielle as the person who had killed Stephen on the 19th of May. Up until then, it was intelligence gathering, which of course intelligence can't always be converted into evidence, and therefore to make sure I had other officers involved, identification officers, Crown Prosecution Service, and to then get enough evidence to ensure I could get an arrest warrant to have him arrested.
By August 1998, the net was tightening, and the police were confident that they knew exactly where Kenneth Noy was hiding out. But in order to ensure that they identified him correctly for Stephen's murder, they needed help from the only person who had truly witnessed the crime. Stephen's traumatized 17-year-old fiancée, Danielle Cable, in whose arms Stephen had bled to death.
He killed John Fordham holding a knife, he'd killed Stephen Cameron holding a knife, so they weren't having any of it.
His main reaction would have been, who grasped me up?
And I'd always said to Danielle, there may come a time when I need you to identify someone.
In August 1998, police believed they'd located murder suspect Kenneth Noy hiding out in Cadiz in Spain. This was their one chance to bring him to justice. So in order to ensure that he was correctly identified, they flew out to Spain, accompanied by their key witness.
Let's not forget, we still got a murder on the 19th of May committed by a man who has not been identified as Kenneth Noy or indeed anybody. So you have an unidentified man. The only person in reality who could identify the offender would be Danielle. I'd kept in touch with Danielle as well as Tony and Ken. And I'd always said to Danielle, look, Danielle, there may come a time when I need you at a moment's notice to be going with officers to anywhere in the world to identify someone. I didn't say who, despite a lot of pressure on her. Young lady, young girl, especially from her family, and I can understand that. These are dangerous people. She said, I want to do it because I want to make sure that I get justice for Stephen. And all credit to her. She's a very brave individual. So I got hold of the identification officer for the county and I said, I want you to go out with Danielle and the chaperone and go out and do the best you can to do a covert identification.
Still only 19 years of age, Danielle Cable bravely agreed to fly from the safety of Swanley to the other side of Europe in the hope of finally getting justice for Stephen Cameron.
As it happened, they were able to find that he was going to a restaurant in a rural area in Spain on the Friday. The identification officer took Danielle to the restaurant where she was able, from a darkened area, so she didn't have to go into the area where he was actually eating, about 50 other people in there, and she positively identified Kenneth Noy as the man who killed Stephen on the 19th of May. So you had the link, you had the identification now of the man, Kenneth Noy, stabbing Stephen Cameron obviously dying at the scene. I went and got the warrant as soon as I had that information, got the warrant sworn out, and within 24 hours, Kenneth Noy was arrested by the Spanish authorities.
Danielle's bravery had paid off, and she was the key to Kenneth Noy's arrest.
Remorse doesn't come into it with Kenneth Noy. Certainly when he was arrested that night, he wouldn't have gone, oh my God, I wish I hadn't killed Stephen Cameron. It doesn't work like that. His main reaction would have been irritation. And also his other reaction would have been, who grassed me up? Who told the police where I was? And that's what would have eaten away at him more than anything else.
Don't forget, when he was arrested eating his supper, he had a knife in his hand. He killed John Fordham holding a knife, he'd killed Stephen Cameron holding a knife. The Spanish police were briefed about the fact that this bloke is wanted in England for stabbing a young lad, and he had a history of killing a police officer, so they weren't having any of it. So I think they were, he was robustly dealt with fairly quickly in terms of being arrested by the Spanish authorities.
Kent Police have been in liaison with the Crown Prosecution Service during the past few weeks, and with the assistance of Interpol, this arrest has been effected. A formal request for extradition of Kenneth Noy will be sent through diplomatic channels to the government of Spain.
After a manhunt that had lasted over 2 years, police finally had Kenneth Noy in custody. However, they still had to undertake the difficult process of extraditing him.
What he did was throw money at a high-powered lawyer and to argue that he shouldn't be extradited because certain procedures hadn't been fulfilled.
Noy told the judges in Madrid today that his arrest was illegal because of flaws in the way he was identified in this restaurant in southern Spain.
Interestingly, claiming when he was in Spain, trying to get out of the extradition, that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the incident on the 19th of May, that it was the police in general that were trying to stitch him up because of his history of having killed John Fordham and that he couldn't get a fair trial. and therefore he didn't do it. He knows nothing about it at all.
After numerous appeals against his extradition, Kenneth Noy finally ran out of options in May 1999. And by April 2000, he was once again in court to face a murder trial. As he did 15 years earlier, he pleaded not guilty on the grounds of self-defense.
He claims he was only provoked to attack Cameron because Cameron was beating him up. And he was determined that he would succeed with this because, of course, he had succeeded with the death of that policeman in his garden.
In the run-up to the trial of Kenneth Noy, we're trying to speak to as many people as possible to put together the story that will follow his conviction or otherwise. And you reach out to everybody, and sometimes you reach out to the bad guys. I was approached by a member of Kenneth Noy's family and met in a lay-by in Kent, and that member of the family attempted to give me information that would sully the reputation of Stephen Cameron. Close associates of Noy were trying to suggest that Stephen had an alternative life, that he was somehow involved in crime, and that he had a very short temper. They were trying to paint a picture of him of somebody who would commit a crime rather than be the victim of it. There was no evidence of that.
By trying to place a stain on Stephen Cameron's character, Noy was inflicting further misery on Stephen's bereaved parents, Kenneth and Tony, who were forced to sit and listen in court whilst their son's killer tried to besmirch his reputation. These underhand tactics had worked in the case of John Fordham a decade earlier, but this time, to counter Noy's defence, the prosecution had a star witness.
The key moment in the trial was the evidence given by Danielle, fiance to Stephen. It was stark, graphic, and everybody who was there will remember it. She stood up in that witness box in an intimidating atmosphere in number 1 court and told it as she saw it. And it was riveting and horrible, and it was devastating to Kenny Noy's case.
On the 14th of April 2000, Kenneth Noy was found guilty of the murder of Stephen Cameron by a jury majority verdict of 11-1, after deliberations that had lasted for 8 hours and 21 minutes. Under conditions of high security, Lord Justice Landom handed Noy a life sentence for his crime.
This is not a joyous occasion. Our lovely son Stephen is dead, and our lives will never be the same again. We will never feel the happiness that we once had. It is hard to put into words our feelings. We are still experiencing overwhelming grief.
Kenneth Noy was safely behind bars, but the police were concerned about his criminal influence, so they offered protection to those who'd given evidence against him.
Danielle, she was put into witness protection. This is a teenager who has seen her fiance stabbed in front of her, murdered in front of her, and that had her life turned upside down. She is in the witness protection scheme still today, and she lives a different life. We don't know where. We know that she's married. We know that she has her own children and that she's happy. We know that she can't see her siblings and she can only see her parents under the tightest security. So even to this day, the impact, the ripples of Stephen's murder continue.
And memories of the senseless murder of Stephen Cameron are even more vivid today. After serving 20 years in prison for the murder of Stephen Cameron, and despite numerous appeals from Stephen's parents to keep him behind bars, 72-year-old Kenneth Noy was finally released from prison on the 6th of June 2019. The parole board observed the move to be a risk, as they said that Noy did not always control extreme emotions well. Not long after, Noy was spotted near the scene of the M25 interchange in Swanley, Kent, where he had stabbed Stephen Cameron to death.
it had an impact in Swanley because where Stephen lived is not very far from the M25, and of course people who lived there felt impacted by it because it was one of their own, so to speak. What Kenny Noy did on the 19th of May totally destroyed the family dynamics of Ken and Tony. They were never the same, I don't think. I kept in contact with them. They'd given me, as a little retirement note, saying, please keep in touch, you know. Well, he's back out now and living the life of Riley. Is that right? And that Danielle is still in witness protection? I don't think it is. That can never be right. Where's the justice in that?
While Danielle has to continue her life in hiding, Stephen's parents, Tony and Kenneth, never recovered from their grief and have both died in recent years. Kenneth Noy is able to live freely, though, despite being responsible for the deaths of not one, but two men.
To just say it's sad would be an understatement. I don't think, if you really want to know, that the criminal justice system is fit for purpose in this country anymore. If you murder someone, you should be in prison for life, and you should come out in a wooden box.
Kenneth Noy's release from prison in 2019 has seen memories of this terrible incident flood back.
What I want people to remember is Stephen Cameron's name. That's what I'd rather they remember than the likes of Kenneth Noy and Ken and Tony. They were an unremarkable family. They were living their life. It was doing normal everyday things, working hard, looking after their children, their grandchildren, and they had their life totally destroyed by some criminal who just thought he could take life and treat people cheaply like that. Totally unacceptable.
These are memories that will continue to be felt by the people in this community.
And by those who were able to get justice for Stephen Cameron.